Classical music is alive. Classical music is creative today. Classical music will be creative tomorrow. The wrong impression that people get when they're not knowledgeable about classical music is that it's like a dead language. Latin, Greek, Etruscan, and many others. And the fact is that the stylistic layers of richness, of centuries, of thoughtful music, of written music that reached us, from polyphony to polyrhythmy to formal organization of music on its own, as well as music participating to the life of the society, from worshipping to battlefields to rejoicing to dancing to singing, combining it all in an opera, in Italian work of all the elements together. Storytelling through opera, through, of course, music also without lyrics that suggest psychologically the moods, and possibly like classical ballet, the gestures drawn in the space are the expression of the art form. And in music, the pitches, and of course, the spaces between the pitches. And then the concept of consonance, dissonance, of modernity, and of old-fashionedness, of course, are evolving all the time. Major minor thirds in Monteverdi were considered dissonances. Mademoiselle Boulanger used to say in the 1920s conference at Rice University that the consonances of tomorrow are the dissonances of yesterday. So is it because we get acquainted to a style that can bring us to express our musicianship with more acute expression that is beyond the form, the essence, in the Romantic era after the Classical era, as we defined them, prior to which was the Baroque era, and the Renaissance, prior to which was Middle Ages. But all these were modern times in their own time. And therefore, avant-garde music in the 1960s was by essence a nonsense, because you cannot be ahead of the other since you're always overpassed. And in order to be avant-garde, that means that you have to consider that there is a linear progression of the stylistic expression, to the point to which the organization of the tones by circle of fifths, by chords that are major or minor, with an implication of the mood, the scales, the modes, the tetrachords, the harmonic progressions, the polyphonic voices that interact with each other without collision or sometimes purposely. All these are the grammar and language of music towards an expression of the creativity in each of the actors of this music making. Would it be Schubert in his room without piano, composing sonatas for piano on his guitar? Would it be Haydn composing Scarlatti, or J.C. Bach as court princehood composers who composed plethoric music for the usage of their patrons, or the individual patrons of Beethoven like Waldstein, Wasumowski, who in a more less dependent composer of music job um, of course, created works which started becoming meaningful contribution on their own compared to the usable music of the time that was disposable music of the time rather, like Bach cantatas, Scarlatti sonatas, and so on, um, to the point to which classical music today is considered as wrongly by those who don't know is a dead tongue because they think we only are museum sort of musicians who either through old instruments reproducing the way it might have sounded, but though we don't have their ears and their psyche and the environment around for longing and tempo and expectation. And in other words, it's out of context, as well as on modern instruments where we deliberately interpret or therefore etymologically translate what we think is the intent of the composer through the filter of the notation, which by essence leaves room for then therefore interpretation. So then comes the recording industry that developed from the beginning of the 20th century, as well as the publishing industry from the centuries before. And so therefore there was a separation between the living performers with the recording and the living presence of the composers with the published works. Therefore, the performers, improvisers like Mozart and Bach and Schubert and many, all of them, Liszt, Chopin, of course, etc., up to Rachmaninoff and Mettner, Scriabin. Of course, the problem is that if everybody speaks the same language, they understand each other. And that was the tonal system, which was adaptable to many different styles and time periods with minor alterations, but nevertheless, whichever you want to call it, you can hear an unknown to you Schubert song and not understand it or love it, but certainly not be shocked by it. And if you hear atonal, post-atonal music after the serialism of Schoenberg and beyond, which in a way brought most composers to embrace their own alphabet, their own grammar, so that if you want to read the book of a certain author, you have to learn the language of the author. There is no translation. You don't translate an atonal piece in tonal. You have to taste it, understand it, appreciate it by being able to read it. And if it's played to you, as performers do, it sounds to you random because it's no more tonal centered. You don't know it, but you get lost. So between random and aggressive to the ear, you don't know which one is which because you lose your basically pendulum. You don't know where to go. In order to be able to appreciate the creativity of given composers after 1950 onwards mostly. And then there are those since then who compose still with a tonal system, not in a tonal way to imitate by pasticcio the composers of the past. It's just because they express themselves through the tools that they were given, just like Schubert, just like Mozart did, and never thought of going atonal, even if they were incredibly intuitive and incredibly gifted musically. They could have thought about it too. Now, it doesn't lessen the importance of evolving, of imagining new ways to transform the musical expression with or without lyrics. But ultimately, I think it's important to be aware that the recording industry or the recording technology, the fact of conserving performances that can be heard constantly anywhere and all the time, has banalized the access to music through oneself or through a performer for oneself. Therefore, the rarity of it has been lost. And then, because the competitivity has been based on the performance of existing pieces, then competitions have existed for famous composers like Chopin, Bach, Beethoven, and lesser sometimes, but generally, the differentiation is minimal between their interpretations because they tend to try to be alike in order to be considered. And then the originality would be then considered an exotic performance that betrays the composer. But who defines what the composer wanted? Who defines how people wrote the unmeasured elements of the notation for the 18th and 19th century when nobody recorded them? The grace notes, were they tied? Were they short, snappy? Were they balanced as a melodic line, basically spread? Yes and no, perhaps in some, perhaps not in all cases. Every time we try to legiferate and say, okay, this is how it's supposed to have been, it's a guess. And of course, I respect very much people who have developed search and research in every niche of time period, from Hildegard, from Bingen to today, and are knowledgeable, because nobody can be knowledgeable in all the elements of such an amount of plethora of offering of music that is the reflective, thoughtful, composed, emotional, dancey, entertaining, but basically meaningful music, not only music that illustrates a video game, a film, or a drama, but also music as a form on its own, like poetry. It's what it is for itself, even if or painting, abstract painting compared to figurative painting. And if that is a possible comparison, then I would say that all of them exist. And the problem often is that the performers of classical music have developed careers in performance or recordings of pieces written before them. In other words, where the workshop of the composer is closed. So what do we explain to the students who have to play it, to explore it? What are the limits of the stylistic authorized or non-authorized tempi, articulation, dynamics, possibility for managing the unmeasured patterns of decorative or ornamental elements? Okay, so that's the signature of the performer, and that was always meant by the composers, except it was in their own time period, where everybody else was bathing in the same musical bath, geographically or temporarily. And they knew very little, or didn't have much access, rather, to the music of their close or distant past in their own time. Nobody asked Chopin to play Beethoven. Nobody asked Bach to play Monteverdi or Frescobaldi. All the composers were performers. All the performers played their own music, and Liszt and was one of the few first before Rachmaninoff to play so much more music of others. And then, but there were also composers, which for the performers was sort of like a denial in a way, because if you're a composer-performer, for those who are performers, the composer-performer by essence takes freedom and is not respectful of the text, because the performer who doesn't compose is by essence, apparently in their eyes, more respectful of the details. So yes, you can respect, disrespect, think outside of the box, inside the box. These are silly ways to differentiate people. I think what matters is how do you get involved, like in a storytelling as an actor, or as a theater play actor. Is it how you tell the drama or the story or whatever it is that the music is saying, even if it's only its form, like the sonata is a form. Yeah, but the substance, if it's a heroic ballad or something, we know, but ultimately the culture and the approach changes in levels, in intensity between one and the other. And so we end up having music lovers prefer the interpretation of such pianist of such piece more than another pianist in a such piece. But what about the piece itself? And who has access to it objectively? Really nobody. Even if you're a musicologist and music scholar and you go through studying the scores and the source materials and the manuscripts and you read articles by musicologists who researched the performance practices of the past, yes, you get a, I would say, partial GPS map of the way people perceive the music, the length of sound, their general harmonic versus melodic, polyphonic versus monophonic, um, genres and stylistic expectations of music. And so the evolution of the instruments, more powerful electrically or on their own, and then reaching individually people by recording or grouped in a place where you share the listening experience. And then you have experts like music reviewers or music professors who are scholars who tell you what this Schubert piece is supposed to be, therefore why the interpretation of this or this person is too slow, too fast, not right or wrong. Again, subjectivity over subjectivity. And to be honest, composers don't know better than the performers how it's supposed to be. They compose the piece, which is a creation that is in scope larger than their lives. It's almost a given thing to them. They heard something before somebody else heard it innerly, or they saw something before the others, or they are imagining fiction which becomes a legend, which becomes a story that we all share. And then it can take all kinds of forms, from the tale to the film to the opera or ballet or anything. We enter in a situation where we involve ourselves in this storytelling. And I find that this relatively silly, while unfortunately not fair, tragic way, perhaps that is exaggerated to say it's tragic, but I would say invisibilization of the composer's pianist is not fair. Okay, that's sort of silly. There are much, way more unfair things in the cruelty of this world, from its past to its present, and alas, possibly in its future. But seen as it is, when you see a singer sing a song, yes, there might be a different author and a different writer of the lyrics who individually are ingredients, but it's the way it's presented by the singer, even sometimes their own authors, in their own way. But let's say they represent it so much that you believe it's theirs. Perhaps it's a momentary rupture of disbelief, but whatever it is, the performer playing a Chopin piece makes you go through the piece. Admittedly, you know the piece, and then you start compared to how you like it, even if you don't play it, if you're just a music lover, not a performer yourself. But then you discover classical music that is not per se atonal or post-tonal, that is relatively traditional in its language, not necessarily in its expression, because so many varieties of expressing oneself with a common language. You can take common words and make a sentence that has a meaning that takes it to another dimension of your imagination as a reader, same as a listener in music. Even in this case, of course, if it's an unknown piece of a composer who they don't know or who you are, and therefore even less known by them, when they listen to the performer who is the composer, then they don't have so much criteria about the interpretation, none. So they start comparing to what it reminds them. Oh, this sounds a little bit like this, or a little bit like that. It's almost as if we start to give a pedigree to how the music reminds us. Of course, we don't do that with Beethoven and Haydn and Mozart because they're so established, even if, in essence, all of them came from a lineage that we can trace them to without to reduce them to it. So when you discover new music that you discover today, it's easy to be trying to see what it reminds you of. And when you hear a piece that you know, then it tries to remind you of what interpretation you like of. But the piece itself, it's always a discovery. Of course, ideally, we should all be able to read the music like we read a book. In other words, be alphabetized in music, which of course has its limits because then you cannot go in atonal music or post-tonal music unless then you learn the language of each composer. You cannot do that because you just don't have the time. And therefore you get lost or just turned off by it, which is meaning that you might miss something very meaningful because it's mathematics or perhaps it's emotion or perhaps it's a combination of tuning systems. I mean, there's so many amazing levels where creativity shows itself. And because of the vastest majority of performers today, therefore, their interpretations become their oeuvre, their compositions, almost superimposed to the piece itself they're playing. And so, therefore, I remember Mademoiselle Boulanger telling me that people hearing Rachmaninoff at intermission in recitals of his, where he played mostly other music than his, were all admirative of him being a pianist. And she mentioned to them he's a composer, and they said, oh, that too. And that takes away nothing from the performer, nor does it add any to the composer, because you could very well dislike the piece or dislike the interpretation. It's the personal choice of each. But the fact that the combination of composer-pianist in the case of the instrument being the infinitesimal minority is either mocked, either considered like some kind of pastime, secondary importance. And because classical music doesn't have the business impact of popular music from all genres, from jazz rock to pop to rap to hip hop and techno and so on and so on. So therefore, that's how the classical music gets sort of cornered. That's what my mom listens when she has a headache, or we don't have classical music as the background in our place, business owners would say, but we have classic rock. And something against classic rock. The question is, why is classical music, for the non-musicians, considered almost like a dead tongue, I was saying earlier, or almost like a medicine for headache? Such paradoxes. Thank you.